All right, thank you for joining us for tonight's event. My name is Catherine. I'm one of the event hosts here at Powell's Books, located in Portland, Oregon. You can check out our coming attractions and lineups of virtual events by visiting our website at powells.com. If you don't already do so, please join us and follow us on social media on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Tonight, we are so excited to welcome John Mark Comer and Tyler Staton. John Mark Comer is the founding pastor of Bridgetown Church in Portland, Oregon, the director and teacher of Practicing the Way, and the best-selling author of the Ruthless Elimination of Hurry and 4 previous books. Much of his writing is focused on the work of spiritualization, formation in post-Christian culture. In his new book, look at it, it's beautiful, Live No Lies, Comer parses out the tactics, strengths, and weaknesses of the forces that seek to wreak havoc in your heart, giving you a clear battle plan and spiritual practices to outwit and overcome these seemingly ancient, yet very much alive adversaries. Joining John Mark in conversation this evening is Tyler Staton. Tyler is the lead pastor of Bridgetown Church in Portland, Oregon. Previously, he served as a co-founder and lead pastor of Oaks Church in Brooklyn. His passion is a community that is unexplainable apart from the love and power of God. Tyler is also the author of Searching for Enough and is currently working on a second book, this one on the topic of prayer. This evening's event will include an audience Q&A. So if you want to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, you could ask a question that way. If you do type it in the chat, that's totally fine. I'll just remind you in the chat as well to just put it in the Q&A box so that way Tyler doesn't have to search for it. If someone has asked a question that you also want to know the answer to, you can click up the thumbs up button next to the question. So that way Tyler can see, which questions are the most urgent. Most importantly, you can support John Mark and Powell's by purchasing a copy of his new book from us. A link to buy Live No Lies, along with a link to Tyler's books, will be shared in the chat a couple of times this evening. All right, John, Mark, and Tyler, it is so wonderful to have you here.
Hey, thank you so much for having us. We're really happy to be along, and welcome to all of you from, sounds like, all over the world.
Yeah, hello, friends. It's so great to be with you. John Mark, it's great to be with you. Congrats, my friend. We're here celebrating the launch of this incredible book, Live No Lies. Well done.
Thanks, man.
Yeah,
it's just nice to be in the same room with you.
Yep.
I just wish we were in the same room with you, but
here we are.
Here we are.
So I'd love to start here. You just wrote a book on Sabbath, and you followed that up with a book on Satan. So I want to ask, how did you get there? Why this book now after your last book? And is there a connection between the two?
Yeah, there definitely is. So if you read my last book, The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, yeah, it's very much about slowing down through practices like Sabbath, silence, simplicity. And so this book could feel like a bit of a radical departure, because now it's a deep dive into really Satan and a lot of cultural kind of issues in the culture wars, not in an angry kind of way, but in an expose kind of way. But actually the two are very much, they go together. I think, Tyler, and I think we share a lot of the similar pastoral heart, in that my heart and really kind of like what I get up out of bed for in the morning is formation, just meaning like, how is it that from our inner woman or man out, we are formed through healing and growth and maturity and the expansion of the soul into a person who's pervaded by love as defined by Jesus through what the ancients called union with Jesus, an increasing experience of the presence and the peace of Jesus. That's like, I was listening to a Tim Ferriss podcast interview a while ago, which I rarely do with a business thinker. I'm not like, me, I'm not like a business organizational leader, guru kind of guy. But somebody sent me this. It was a long form interview with Jim Collins, who wrote arguably like the most successful business book of all time, Good to Great. And I think he's a Catholic, I'm not sure, but he was really wise. And at one point he made this great statement. He said, everybody working in the knowledge economy or in a creative field of work has one central operating question that all of their work is built around. And then he said what his was, and it had to do with business. And I immediately, it was like a kind of a eureka moment. I immediately thought, oh yeah, I know exactly what mine is. And it's, how do we change? How do we experience healing? It's like, there's lots of Christian talk about healing or salvation or redemption, but what's the mechanism of discipleship by which we actually experience that healing and growth and formation. So that's my pastoral, like, kind of heart. Like, that is what I believe in all of the church. I love the church. There's a lot of other stuff that you have to do as the lead pastor of a church, as you know.
Yep.
And one of the reasons that we just switched roles, or not switched roles, but changed roles, is because I want to give myself more to that work. And there's lots of other stuff that you have to do as the pastor of church. It's really good and meaningful work, like put on Sunday gatherings and organize community and lead justice initiatives. Very important stuff. But I really wanted to give myself more kind of to this work of formation. And at a pastoral level, after years of pastoring, and I would love to hear your perspective on this, in my mind, I think I've identified two major kind of primary obstacles that hold people back from formation, from the spiritual journey in the way of Jesus, from even really seriously following Jesus in such a way that they grow and mature over time. The first one was hurry and busyness and digital distraction and their phone and overcommitment. And so that was the last book. And the other one is kind of very, like, bold language from Jesus, would be the language of lies, but we could just say secular assumptions about what is good and beautiful and true that keep you from even viewing Jesus and his teachings as they come to us in the New Testament and the Christian tradition as beautiful or good or true. And if you don't want to follow Jesus, if you don't find him compelling, as I so believe he is, then you're not going to then ask the follow-up question of, how do I follow Jesus? So after this, I am working on a book series all on formation. It's going to, like, start from the ground up of discipleship. But I think two obstacles that keep people from even going on that journey of how do I follow Jesus is, why do I even want to? These secular assumptions that we live in. So that's what this book is kind of a deep dive into. And that's how the two, in my evil genius mind, go together.
Yeah. And I see that too. I think that no one comes to Jesus with an empty life.
Yes.
For him just to shape from the ground up. And that's what your last book was a lot about. It's about looking at all that has gotten into your life and kind of giving enough space for the message of Jesus to tinker around in there and reorder. But also, no one comes to Jesus unformed in their mind. No one comes to Jesus as a blank slate in terms of their ideas and what they think and what they value, and ultimately what they give their attention to.
Yeah.
And so that's much of what this one is about, as I've had the joy of reading it. And that's John Mark, the pastor. What about you just as a person? What makes a person want to write a book on evil, and on Satan and
on the world, the flesh, and the devil?
Yeah.
I was just reading Marshall Linehan's memoir. Have you read that one yet?
No.
You're a memoir fan.
I am.
I get all my memoir recommendations from this guy. I'm reading Lit right now by Mary Carter.
Yeah, so good.
She is lit. That woman can write. Holy cow. So we trade memoirs. I have one for you over on the shelf over here. But in her memoir, she's arguably the therapist who brought mindfulness into Western therapy.
Okay.
And so she's an interesting, like, Christian Buddhist therapist person, comes from a very intense background, was institutionalized as a child for multiple years. And she had this great line where she said, "We study what pains us," as she was explaining why she gave her life to therapy for the most troubled people and ended up basically changing the way therapy is done in the West and basically introducing mindfulness to the popular culture and other things, from her own experience of pain, of being institutionalized as a child and cutting and trauma. And I thought, I love that we study what pains us. And I think, you know me, Tyler, at some level. So that I struggle with personality theories. I think people put way too much stock in them.
Yeah.
I don't think they're actually true. I think they're theories and they're interesting ways to perceive one angle of yourself, But
you also love them.
But I also love them. So I hate them. But Myers-Briggs, which is arguably the most accurate of the personality theories, it gives you it spits out like a 4-letter summary of your personality, right? So INSP or whatever it is. And mine, if you Google, you can do this, it's really fun. You can Google your Myers-Briggs type and then Google a famous movie, and it will tell you what character you're most like. You are in the movie, meaning you're most like in the movie.
Oh, wow.
And it's wildly inaccurate, but it's just a fun gag.
Yeah.
So I stopped doing it. I did it about 3 or 4 times and I immediately stopped. In every single example I could think of, I am the evil genius. So
Really?
in Star Wars, I'm not Darth Vader, because he like comes around at the end. He started good as little Annie. You know, I'm Emperor Palpatine. In Harry Potter, I'm he who must not be named. In Breaking Bad, I'm whatever the guy's name is. Like I'm the evil genius. If you Google me and like famous, my personality, it's all the like, you know, Stalin, Lenin, homicide, you know, the communist genocide, like the greatest genocide in human history was committed by people with my like personality type.
You're also ironically most likely to be an atheist, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Most likely to be an atheist, you know. So the point there is, the pain is not at a pastoral level, at a personal level. I am not a naturally nice or happy person. Like, you know, my wife T, who's downstairs right now, she is naturally
humming and happy, probably
nice and happy. You know, I think if she wasn't a follower of Jesus, she'd still be a pretty kind person. You know, I think it's just how God endowed her. I would not. I'm not sure I am. This is me with Jesus. Yeah. This is me seriously following Jesus. You know, I shudder at a very serious level. I shudder to think who I would be without Christ, and at a character level. And so for me, I have a vested interest in the question of formation. How do we heal? How do we grow? How do we mature? How do we become a person of love? I have 3 kids also downstairs, and nobody parents their kids without wounding them. And I want to parent them in such a way that I mitigate against that, and I love them well and serve them well. So that's a long way of saying, I really care about this question of the healing of the soul. And I discovered through writing Hurry, you mentioned like there's a body thing and then a mind thing. The last book was about the body and this one's more about the mind. It's really insightful, because what I came to the conclusion that it's almost like you could think about formation and kind of growth and maturity in 2 bands. The kind of upper band is like what you do with your body. And so you need to like practice the spiritual disciplines, slow down, rest, take your body, your soma seriously as not just a container, but actually as part of who you are, and integrate to your trauma, your memories in your body. There's that kind of just band of rule of life as language that we would use. Yeah. How do you create a schedule? How do you create a lifestyle architecture that is conducive for deep inner healing and change and transformation? But then what I realized was that kind of building a rule of life, slowing my life down, ordering my life around the practices and prayer, that got me like significant growth and healing in my own journey. But it, shocker, like wasn't a silver bullet. It didn't fix all of the problems. Yeah. And even when I'm still there sitting on Sabbath, well rested, living in community, you know, having done some spiritual disciplines, still my mind was often deeply troubled by ideas, by thoughts, and by feelings and emotions in my body, that just the lifestyle band was definitely not a cure-all. Not that this next book is there is no cure-all, just hate to give it away, but there's no cure for being human. And you know, there's actually a book, a memoir come out, Kate Fowler's book just released today. She's one of my favorite writers. Did you read her Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I Have Loved?
I know of that book, but I've never read it.
That's one of my favorite memoirs, and she just released a second one today entitled There's No Cure for Being Human. And Kate, you're very right. There's no cure for being human. And so my point is, I think I had to take seriously not just curating a lifestyle or a set of practices or habits or a rule, but actually curating, I think in Portland language, we would say our consciousness, our thought life, our mind. And that's Paul's thing, you know, Romans 12, do not be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So much of this book is about the renewing of the mind, and it's about some of the ideas and really the ideologies that are almost animated by like a dark energy that often trouble us and keep us from experiencing peace, and specifically like peace with a capital P, as in living in the peace in the presence of Jesus.
Yeah. And, you know, I want to get into the content of the book just a little bit. And in the introduction, you talk about writing a manifesto for exile. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the time we live in, the context we live in Western secular culture, and what you see that doing to our minds.
Yeah. So, I mean, gosh, I almost would rather put the question back on you and have you riff. It feels like there's a couple of biblical metaphors for different felt experiences of the followers of God at different times and places in history and around the world.
Mm-hmm.
So one would be the metaphor, and I think these are historic stories, but the metaphor, but they're more than just historic stories about, they're not just, it happened, it happened and it happens.
Right.
And so there's the motif of Exodus,
Mm-hmm.
right, where people who are oppressed under unjust systems cry out to God and are liberated and delivered, saved by God from injustice and oppression. And that's the experience of many Christians around the world today and down through history, and many Christians even in our own nation's history, as we all know. Then there's the metaphor of like Jerusalem and Israel, where you have this kind of God-fearing nation that is never the kingdom of God, because it's God-fearing and it's kingdom-ish, but it's always beset by corruption and complicity and leaders that rise and fall and come and go, and some are good and some are bad and most are in between, and some are really bad and a few are really good, but not very many. And historically, this would be, what historians call Christendom. This was much of Western Europe for over 1,000 years. It was never Christian. It was always a mix of Christian and pagan, and then Christian and secular kind of ideas and ideologies and cultural norms. But there was a long period of time where the overarching kind of cultural currents would index you toward a basic Christian value system with a few glaring exceptions, you know?
Yeah.
But it was hard, like Charles Taylor writes about this, 500 years ago, it was almost impossible intellectually to be an atheist.
Mm-hmm.
Like they existed, but I mean, it was like really hard to not believe in God. Now,
he talks about the courageous thing at that time being to doubt.
Exactly.
And the courageous thing today being belief.
The opposite, because now you can be a pastor of a church, you can be an Orthodox Christian writing a book about whatever, and it's hard to believe in God. Mm-hmm. And it's easy to be an atheist, and it's easy to doubt, because everybody is all around you. That the cultural norms, the cultural currents of a city like Portland, or just the internet, the West in general, index you away most of the time from faith in general, and definitely anything resembling Christian orthodoxy and the way of Jesus, Mm-hmm. So the metaphor that I think best captures the moment we're in now is the biblical metaphor motif of exile. Yeah. And that's what happened after the compromise and complicity of Israel was so bad with, the idols and the idolatries of the surrounding world, that they ended up, dragged away into exile in Babylon. And so now they're this minority in this larger kind of macro culture, dominant culture, pluralistic culture, spiritual to the core, but not worshiping Yahweh, the one true God of Israel and the creator of the heavens and the earth, worshiping all sorts of other gods and goddesses, all sorts of other sexual norms, gender norms, family norms, relational norms, fiscal or monetary norms. And Israel is actually doing really well. They're not oppressed in exile. Most of them are making a lot of money. They're often successful. They're involved in politics, some of them. But the question is, how do you keep your faith intact? How do you stay a people? How do you stay a people who are true in their fidelity to God? And how do you keep your spiritual life alive? You can't go to the temple and worship because the temple's 1,000 miles away and has been destroyed. How do you worship God? How do you have a vibrant relationship with the Creator when you're in Babylon, Mm-hmm. And so that, I think, is the biblical motif that is more fitting for where we're at now. And this is a long time coming, but this used to just be true of those of us in Portland, or you came from Brooklyn, mm-hmm. or New York City, or San Francisco, or LA. If you're in a really secular, really urban, really progressive space, Babylon is the proper motif for decades. Yeah. Or if you're in, the Ivy League, or you're in intellectual elite circles, it's been that way arguably for a couple hundred years. But what's new is that through the internet and through a number of other cultural factors, I think arguably mostly the sexual revolution in the 1960s on, Babylon has now spread. It's gone viral. And so anywhere that has Wi-Fi access and a phone, or we're all in what, Barna, which is a think tank, calls digital Babylon. Yeah. And so the question of the book is really, how do we thrive here? because I've been in this city for a long time, following Jesus in this city for a long time, and it's easy for me to take on like a siege mentality, like just kind of hold down the fort. Or for other people,
like a survival spirituality.
survivalist spirituality with no love, no suffering love, no hope, no buoyancy of joy, no openness. And then for other people, maybe you're listening and you're on the other end by personality or context, where it like the easy thing for you is just to kind of get assimilated and sucked in and just like adopt the cultural norms as your norms, maybe hold to a vague kind of Christian faith, but let it lose its teeth, and traction in you. And neither of those postures lead to life. And so I know that both pastorally and personally. So that's really the question is how do we flourish? How do we live deeply joyful and meaningful and relational communal lives in this kind of a cultural space?
Yeah, and even if you think about biblical Babylon, the rebel of biblical Babylon was Daniel.
Yes.
And the rebellious thing he did was observe the hours of prayer, like dig his elbows into the same grooves in his windowsill and continue to face Jerusalem and pray 3 times a day.
And it almost got him killed.
Yeah.
I was on a call a couple of hours ago. I'm doing a bunch of press stuff for the book. And I happened to be on one kind of interview thing and with a bunch of Africans the call was kind of, there was some South Africans there. I was like the only Western person on the call. It was really cool. South Africans, a Ugandan, and a Nigerian. And it was such a good space. I said yes to it just to put myself in that space.
Yeah.
And be like the one white Western guy from Portland who's just listening and learning. And there was a professor from Nigeria, Dr. Sunday, made the greatest point. He said, he said to me, actually, he said, all Christians everywhere face persecution. It just looks different at different places in different times. And then he said, for you, your persecution is the ideologies of Western culture. And he said, our persecution is Boko Haram. We are literally under threat. 42 Christians had just been killed by Muslim jihadists. But it was really interesting. So I think of myself as, we don't face persecution. Persecution is something from Boko Haram if you're in that part of Nigeria or whatever, or some other part of the world. But that actually wasn't his perspective. His perspective was, we all face persecution, if not violence, pushback to our faith. And in the West, much of that is to do with ideas and ideologies.
Yeah, and you're touching a little bit on an idea that I wanted you to flesh out some, which is, so your book is based around this ancient Christian understanding of the world, the flesh, and the devil. But it's not, we don't hear that language even from Christian pastors much today. Like, although that is very much historic Christianity. And some of what was being articulated by, I think you said Dr. Sunday, is that right?
Yes, Dr. Sunday, yes.
So some of what was being articulated by him has to do with the world, or maybe the way that the forces of evil partner with the principalities and powers in biblical language, or just the air we breathe in our understanding today. And then I am intrigued also by your thoughts on writing on and teaching on the personified evil that we often call the devil. Because there was a time, and it wasn't that long ago, when in the US, the assumption was sin. Like, I've got things wrong with me. I can't always seem to be who I want to be. And so
I'm not right with God.
Yeah, the role of the church was primarily to convince people that there really was a God good and loving enough to forgive you, reconcile you, and take you in as his own. But today, it's almost like the assumption is, who wouldn't love me, accept me, and take me in as their own? Of course, if there is a divine being, that divine being must be the personification of love. But what's hard to convince people of, even Christians, like people sitting in pews, is that there really is a personified evil out there who wants to warp your desires, twist your thoughts, and see your destruction. And so I just would love to hear you riff on how we've ended up there, because one other thought just to throw into this jumble is that Jesus said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. And you have done a lot of teaching and a lot of writing on the way of Jesus, on reordering your life around his way. But the truth is that truth is also a part of that you can practice the way of Jesus, but if he ultimately isn't your authority, the way that you're viewing the world, your understanding of your person, then you can't get to the life of Jesus. It's the way and the truth. And this book reads to me like it's more about grappling with the truth of Jesus, looking into some of maybe the more hard to interpret or understand things he said and saying, do you believe this? Is this the lens through which you view the world? So can you talk to us about the world, the flesh, and the devil as an understanding? And then maybe a little bit about your own reflections of speaking about the personification of evil.
Yeah. Well, okay, let me put it back on you a little. There was some really insightful stuff in there. So the world, the flesh, and the devil arguably comes from the desert fathers and mothers in the 3rd century. And we both have
we're
this
obsessed
strange
with
affinity. And I keep talking about the desert fathers and mothers. I'll be like talking to pastors and be like, wait, who were them? 3rd century, like BC, AD. I'm realizing, I think we're in a niche, you know? So maybe for those listening, I can explain more about what this paradigm is, but maybe talk about who were the desert fathers and mothers and what prompted them to go out into the desert and pray.
Yeah, the desert fathers and mothers were essentially the original monks. They founded monasticism accidentally.
Arguably, they started the formation movement. Way before it was cool.
Yeah, exactly. And what happened was, there was that famous moment in Christian history where Christianity was this incredible, radical counterculture that was infecting the Roman Empire in the best way. But growing like wildfire. And then the Emperor Constantine, some would say because of benefit, who knows how much sincerity or political benefit was behind it, but he made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. At that point, the Christian church began to dilute. And we learned something that we've seen repeated throughout church history, which is that when the Christian church buddies up with power, it tends to lose its saltiness in the language of Jesus. And when the Christian church is in maybe what we call hard soil or is powerless, it tends to grow in spiritual power. So this was the first time that the Christian church had buddied up with worldly power and become diluted. And the desert fathers and mothers were these few radicals who wandered off into the desert during that time and essentially, in my view, reenacted Jesus's temptation. And for a new time said, we're going to live in the desert. We're going to face down the enemies of our time, face down the temptations and resist them on behalf of the movement of Jesus of Nazareth. And they preserved the saltiness of the church during a critical point in history. And then we've seen that repeated. So the desert fathers and mothers are people that I look back to as heroes because they weren't just monks in that they lived their lives by this crazy order. They also were like the original charismatics. They were supernatural. They were praying for faith healing,
casting out demons, and
and they knew the power of the Spirit in wild expressions and in contemplative silence. And so they were people who I have a ton of affinity toward spiritually, and I know that you do as well. And I think have a lot of parallels to our moment today and might be the community to learn from for the church today. So that's the setup of who they are. Why did you want me to give that? Where are you going with this?
Your vision of the church as for our church as desert fathers and mothers in the city. That's your language, not mine. I love it. So I wanted you to give that up. You teed that up so well. So the desert fathers and mothers identified what they called the 3 enemies of the soul, which in their thinking was almost like a counter trinity to the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit at war. And it was, Gerald Sitzer's summary of the desert fathers and mothers is they gave us what he called, his focus is less on the contemplative stuff and more on what he called a spirituality of struggle. That spirituality is a kind of struggle with the enemies of the soul and they identified them based on their reading of the New Testament as the world, the flesh, and the devil. But you said it so well, their paradigm for the desert, for what we would today kind of call the practice of silence and solitude and stillness, was not Sabbath. It was the temptation narrative in
Mhm.
Matthew 4 and Luke 4. They said Jesus went out into the desert to be tempted by the devil, end quote, Matthew chapter 4, to fight Satan. And so, Henry Nouwen has that book that we both love, The Way of the Heart, which I'm
Yep.
sure Pablo's has. It's my favorite Nouwen book. And
Yeah, me
that's
too.
saying something because he's a genius.
And you can read it in 45 minutes.
It's beautiful. I think I've read it 4 or 5 times. We
Yeah.
read it once with a bunch of our friends.
Mhm.
And, he has this great line that whenever I teach on solitude, I quote, where he writes, solitude is not a private, and it's all about the Desert Fathers and Mothers. So it's his interpretation of the best of the contemplative tradition from the Desert Fathers and Mothers. And he has this line that solitude is not a private therapeutic place. It is the place of conversion where the old self dies and the new self is born. It is the place of encounter. And so for him, solitude is where you go to encounter God, but also where you go to encounter yourself, good, bad, and ugly, like the real you comes to the surface in prayer, and also where you go to encounter the devil.
Mhm.
And we're thinking like, why would you do that on purpose? And I think their logic was, this is coming at you all of the time, but if you don't realize it, then you get sucked in, And so that sounds like not compelling. Like, I don't want a spirituality of struggle. I want a spirituality of Sabbath. But it's like M. Scott Peck, one of my favorite books is his book, The Road Less Traveled. And his opening line is, life is difficult. And then he goes on page 1 and he just has this simple observation that life is hard. Life is difficult. This is the first of Buddha's 4 Noble Truths. Life is suffering. But if you expect life to be easy, as most Western people do, you kind of expect life to be up and to the right, and it's going to go well, and it's going to keep getting better with time, then you become neurotic. Like, psychologists define neuroticism as when you suffer more than you need to. Like, we all suffer, but neuroticism is when we suffer more than we need to, where there's a difference between, psychologists distinguish between suffering and pain. Suffering is like what is. Pain is the meaning and the feeling that comes from our interpretation of what is.
Yeah.
And that's where the neuroticism and the kind of brain stuff is, But counterintuitively, Peck points out, if you expect life to be hard and difficult, then most people, not all, but most people conclude that life is hard and difficult, but really good and full of goodness and beauty and joy and community and justice and meaning. And so I think similarly, in Christian spirituality, if you expect following Jesus to be easy, this is just Sabbath and kind of a Christian version of Buddhism, and how do I kind of become a nice and kind person and just feel good about myself and my life. If that's what you expect, and then you walk into a war zone, you're going to feel spiritually neurotic. But if you expect life to be a struggle, a kind of, we have enemies, and whether you're a Christian or not, you are at war with these enemies, the world, the flesh, and the devil, then arguably most Christians still, on the whole, find life to be deeply joyful and good with God.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to kind of frame it in the right way. So what I was trying to do, same as you, I heard a tiny bit of talk about the world, the flesh, and the devil when I was a little kid for a few years when we went to this like kind of hellfire and brimstone church.
Mm-hmm.
It's the last time I remember anybody talking about it. And nobody is talking about it now in the sense of, the devil. Most Christians don't even believe in the devil anymore. It's like right up there with Thor's hammer and Santa Claus.
Yeah.
The flesh, we don't use that language anymore. It doesn't even make sense in a hedonistic culture where it's all about feeling good and sensuality and sexuality. And the world is just not language that's common anymore. Like, we talk about the arts or entertainment or economics or politics or systemic racism. We don't call it what the New Testament, what Jesus calls it, which is the world. So I guess what I wanted to do in the book was, I think my assumption is that every person and every Christian is living under assault from these 3 enemies, and they often don't even realize what's hitting them. And so they have all of this chaos in their mind and their body, and they can't make sense of it. I wanted to put language, categories, biblical theology to name the felt experience of this and help people actually identify what's coming at them in order to stand against it and actually flourish and thrive.
Yeah. And would you say that, as I hear you talking about that moment in silence and solitude, when you, yes, are communing with your true self, but also doing battle with your false self, would you say that a lot of grappling with the world, the flesh, and the devil is learning to identify one's false self and know it for what it is, which is also, formation language for essentially like the brand of the disease I carry.
Yes. That's well
And
said.
because there can be a lot of freedom in that. And you were talking about, kind of the rage around personality types and all those sorts of tests and everything. And that's my only issue with them, is that a lot of them, like the Enneagram, which is very popular, it's actually about knowing and naming your false self. It's not about giving permission to your personality type. It's about,
or weaponizing it against other people.
right. It's about
dealing with your sin.
Yeah, like I'm an Enneagram type 3, and what that does for me is it shows me what my shadow looks like so that I can see it.
Yeah.
So I can recognize it and struggle against it,
Yeah.
like you're describing. So I think that that's such a powerful tool that you're giving folks.
Yeah, and I think, this is a Powell's books talk, not a we're at church talk.
Mm-hmm.
And some of this can sound crazy to not a Christian person or to somebody from a culture like ours. But let me just give you two little nuggets of wisdom from a psychologist I love. One is that when you create a pride position, you create a shame position. So if you live in a worldview that doesn't believe in sin and wants to basically adopt a humanistic, secular view of the human person, I'm a basically good person who's just been at some point kind of influenced by my environment in negative ways. And that's truth. There's lots of truth in that. But if you create this position of I'm a good person just the way I am, I'm lovable, I'm accepted, I'm wonderful, in creating that pride position, you're creating a shame position, because it's not actually who any of us are. We all have dark stuff in us. We all have mixed up, not just motivations, but often decisions we've made in our past or are making in our present. And so then you create a shame position. Second quote would be, you're never smarter than your brain. So don't try to outthink your brain. So you can tell yourself, I'm good, there's nothing wrong with me, I'm great just the way I am. But your brain is smarter than that. Your brain knows, like, I messed up and I hurt this person and I made this bad decision and I live with this woundedness and I have this, penchant for whatever. And so you can't out. So a better way to approach all of this, I just think, is to run not away from your sin, but toward Jesus. Yeah. And let him both deal with your sin at a legal level with your future and what, some would call justification, whether that's the best language for that or not. And at a formation level in your present through healing you in the here and now,
Yeah. So we've talked about, what, like, some of the content behind the book, why you wrote it. I want to get to a couple of other questions, and then I am going to engage some of these Q&A questions that have come in.
Thank you.
This isn't, you aren't just eavesdropping on this conversation. I know that you've been asking things. I'm going to get to a few of them, but could you first just say, who are you writing to here? Who's the primary audience you had in mind as you're writing this book? And then are there other groups that you think like this will speak to as well?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a follower of Jesus and I'm a pastor, so I'm not an evangelist, as some would call it. So I want to write something that's for thoughtful Christians, but is open and accessible to anybody who is not from the Christian tradition at all, but is open and curious. But I think, Tyler, you could kind of, this is a gross oversimplification, but you could break the church down into kind of three groups of people. One is like the inner core of disciples of Jesus, who they're not going to be swayed by the world, the flesh, and the devil. Mm-hmm. And so this book will hopefully help them at an intellectual level kind of just make sense of the ideas and ideologies that swirl around us in the culture wars. And, then there's a group on the other side that is basically semi-Christian, but has turned away from following Jesus. And this book will likely just become a point of resistance for them. It will just deepen their hostility and hardness toward me or toward Jesus himself and anything resembling Christian orthodoxy, even if they still have some moniker of Christian. But then a lot of us are in this kind of middle group where it's like, we love Jesus and we want to follow Jesus, but we're living in this crazy time. And we're so turned off by much of what we see in the news about the church in the West. And there's these culture wars. And often we feel like Christians are just on the wrong side of both stuff, and it's so hard not to just get kind of co-opted by all of it and sucked in and have your mind get almost like subsumed in these secular assumptions about reality, whether it's on the right or the left or some mashup of the two. And I think that's who I'm writing to the most, is those of us that are in that middle space, that our heart is not hard to Jesus. We love and want to follow Jesus, but we often feel like we're drifting, or we feel like we're stuck, or we can't make sense of the world, or the gospel doesn't sound like good news, and the gospel of sexual liberation sounds like good news, or the gospel of materialism, upward mobility sounds like better news, or the gospel of individualism and be true to yourself sounds like better news. And so, but our heart isn't hard, like we're in that space. So I think that is most likely the primary person that I'm writing to.
Yeah. So the last question I want to ask you is probably the most personal one. So I'm going to save it for our final question. A number of people of you who are writing in are asking about translating big ideas like the world, the flesh, and the devil for different groups, whether that's younger people, contexts outside of the church. I think a lot of your language of lies actually does that quite well. So could you speak to that idea of how do I talk about these ideas that I deeply believe over a drink with friends,
Yes.
When the subject comes up, or I lead a small group of middle schoolers at my local church, or how do I introduce your soul has an enemy?
Yes.
And all that stuff.
Yeah. Goodness. Well, I mean, I don't know. How would you answer that, Tyler?
I don't know. I was hoping you could come. I think that, to me, the point at which this book meets, there's always points at which following Jesus in a cultural moment like meshes with the culture quite well and speaks a language people can understand. And there's other ways it's just like, you're just gonna have to swim against the current here.
Yes.
And
so
I
racial
think
justice might be a place where there's a deep alignment with Jesus' vision and some of the cultural currents, and sexuality might be very different. Or materialism, or
and like practicing certain spiritual formation practices can have a moment right now because they're matching. Maybe there's like a wellness movement in the culture that
Christian mindfulness.
So I would say the language of lies, which Jesus says is the weapon of the enemy, that the enemy is not, he's not a violent pitchfork bringer. He is a deceiver. So he plants lies in your psyche that usually are ways to go after something good in a way that will destroy you while you go after them. And so I think that that's the way to talk about it, is lies that you believe. And the way I would answer it is to say that there's different definitions of the word true. There is the truth, like in a doctrinal or definition sense, like this is factually true. But a more ancient definition of true, and the one that the scripture, or more, I would say, a more Hebrew definition of true, is more like something that goes straight. So it's like you shoot an arrow, and if it flies straight, then you'd say that's a true shot, right? We don't use that definition much anymore, but that to me is more the definition of Jesus. If you want to see if my teachings are true, try them and see, like, am I now moving straight? Am I ending where I aimed to go when I put these teachings on? And so I would say to identify a lie is this something I believe would take me somewhere, and yet I'm noticing it's actually taking me somewhere different, which involves a lot of paying attention to and noticing oneself and everything like that. That's how I would answer it. Is you have to talk about lies. You have to understand the enemy as a deceiver, and you have to learn the ancient practice of discernment, which we've essentially dumbed down, at least in the Western evangelical church, to like pray, and if lightning strikes, then you otherwise do what you were going to do otherwise. And there's rich traditions of discernment in the Christian faith. So I don't know. Those are the things that I would talk about.
Yeah, I think that's really good.
You got anything better than that?
Well, I mean, I'm not reading the actual question. If the questions are, how do we take some of these ideas and translate them to middle schoolers or a different context, or my elderly grandparents in the South, or whatever it is, then, I think there's some basic principles of like, know your material, know your audience, and use their language. So know your material, you have to do the work. Like you're here, you're at a book launch, man, for Powell's books. That means you're likely a reader, a thinker, a thoughtful person. And man, I think just a lot of work goes into thinking well and thinking Christianly and thinking compassionately about other narratives in the culture. And so I think that's a lot of reading, it's thinking, it's podcasting, it's paying attention to your city, it's reading the news and op-eds. And not all of us have hours a day to do this kind of stuff, but just with whatever time resources you have available, know your material, study, think. I mean, I'm shocked at how much lazy, shallow thinking there is right now, which makes sense in the digital age where everything's clickbaity, and how many people think in like slogans and sayings from the culture wars that aren't even coherent. And there's often a ton of philosophy and thought, hundreds of years old sometimes, behind some of these slogans, but people don't have all of that. And so they'll just adopt a slogan and kind of champion it and tweet it or whatever. And that's lazy thinking, So I think you got to know your material, whatever the issue is. Secondly, you got to know your people. Like, it's so helpful for me to talk this stuff out, like with my wife or with my kid. My oldest son is 15, Jude, and you can really see when their eyes gloss over, okay, I'm not making my point now, or when they're angered, or when they're offended, or when they're confused, So maybe you try it on with some people in your, target demographic, And then third, I think the most helpful thing for me is sometimes forcing myself to adopt normal language rather than Christian cliches, And so like in my section on the devil, I'll talk more about deceptive ideas than I do, or about ideologies. And instead of saying they're demonic, I'll say they have a dark spiritual energy behind them. Because dark spiritual energy is something that a Portlander can vibe with. Like, oh, we know about but demons, we don't believe in those, but we know about dark spiritual energy. So sometimes it's just a matter of using more language loses meaning over time. And so if you want to get traction with people, you have to constantly update your language in order for it to actually get into people's brain and arrest their heart in some way and actually give them a path forward,
Yep. All right. This is a simple one, but one I actually want to know the answer to. What's the inspiration behind the cover art?
Oh, the cover art.
Yeah. I mean, you're a man of fine taste. I remember you sending me a few different covers. What do you think? But they all kind of had the same design basis behind it. So
okay, we went through more cover iterations on this one than any other book I've ever done. So my publisher is really kind. They've always let me use an outside designer, so which is very gracious of them. And I've used the same designer on all 6 of my books. This is guy Ryan Wesley Peterson, who is husband to my wife's best friend. We were in community for years together. He's since moved away for a job with Facebook in the Bay Area, but he does all my books. And so we went through a ton of different ideas this one, and it was just disaster after disaster. He's a brilliant designer, but we just could not get the right thing. And so we finally came up with this schema, and I really love it. It's one of my favorite covers I've done, if not my favorite. And basically, if you open up the book, there are 3 parts, the devil, the flesh, and the world. Each has a kind of geometric image of a triangle for the devil, and of a square for the flesh, and of a kind of world-shaped angular circle for the world. And the cover, you would never know this just looking at it, is actually those 3 shapes all mashed up and overlapping. So the idea is like, it's very, very much an illusion. It's like a nod, if even a nod, is that these 3 things go together, and the world, the flesh, and the devil kind of work in synergy against us.
Very cool. And what about, can you speak to mental health and the lies of the enemy? So how do we distinguish between clinical depression and one of the enemy's lies, or are they working in tandem somehow?
Yeah. I mean, that's a wise and delicate question. And on one hand, we really want to avoid the toxic, immature extreme of some arms of the church that would just kind of cast out the demon of depression or the demon of anxiety or the demon of gayness or the demon of, and people have been deeply harmed and even traumatized by some of that shoddy kind of theology. On the other hand, we have to be honest and admit that the bifurcation between mental, emotional, spiritual, physical, this is a Western category. At nowhere in reality do these things exist in separate categories other than in a chapter in a book, or in some like sermon or essay that you're reading. Mental, emotional, and there's all sorts of scientists talking about how those aren't even separate categories, and even mind and body scientifically that bifurcation doesn't really hold up, you know? So I think the gospel writers are way more comfortable than we are in eliding categories like illness and demonization. And at some point, it's not that it doesn't matter, it's that the task is very similar either way. When you have a thought that comes to mind that is wreaking havoc inside you, whether that thought is just a random synapse firing in your brain based on what you had for lunch that day or traumatic experience in your childhood, or whether that thought is either from a demonic spiritual entity or just animated by some kind of a dark spiritual energy. At some point, we've all had the experience. It might sound crazy, like so the Desert Fathers and some others, their reading of Matthew 4 was that we go to the desert, we go to solitude to fight the devil, and that the devil's primary war against us is through thoughts. It is in our mind. That they believe that the devil has direct access to our mind and imagination, to our feelings, that he can implant thoughts in our mind that sabotage us from the inside out. They use this Greek word logosmai. That's very hard to translate into English, but it can be translated thoughts or thought patterns or internal belief structures or narratives that we live by. It's these kind of videos that play in our mind all through the day from the morning that we wake up, and these assumptions that we maybe have about the world around us. They believe, based on their reading of Jesus, that the devil comes at us with these thoughts, and that the way that Jesus fought back was not through a lightning bolt or screaming at the devil or working up some big hoopla, but was by calmly quoting scripture, which they interpreted not as a magic incantation or even as a Bible study, but as what neuroscientists today would call thought redirection, as Jesus, in popular language, would just change the channel of his mind. The mind can't not think. So when a thought comes in, you're unlovable, you'll always be lonely, God is angry at you, you can do whatever you want. Like when that thought comes in, you can't not think it.
You can't just erase.
You can't just erase it. You can't just say, stop thinking I'm unlovable, stop thinking you have to think about something else. And so what they would do based on their reading of Jesus, like I talk about one of my favorite of the Desert Fathers, Evagrius Ponticus, who wrote this insane book in the 4th century called Talking Back, subtitle is a monastic handbook for combating demons. I thought it sounds so wacky. I thought it was going to be nonsense. I read it and I'm telling you, it is some of the most brilliant, intellectual, insightful stuff I've ever read in my life. And, he coined this language that was then later used by the Desert Fathers and Mothers of antarikis, I think is the Greek word. You can translate it talking back or counter talking, and they called it counter talking. Like the devil comes at you with a thought, it's animated, and that might sound crazy to our Western ears, but think about it. Like, have you ever had a thought that felt like it was from outside of you, that felt like it wanted to be thought? It felt like it feels like the thought has a will to it, like it has a force, an energy, a power even behind it, that it wants to be thought, that is often like a malignant thought. It wants to like make you angry or anxious or bitter or confused or despairing. And it's like it's forcing its way into your mind, and like it has a power, and it's like you almost can't not think it. I think almost all of us have had that experience. Evagrius and many others would say, yeah, that's because it's a demon. Or that's because it's a demonically animated. There's some kind of an inner spiritual energy behind it that is ruining
or
you.
a dark spiritual
energy, more important than language, And the way you fight back is you don't have to scream, you don't have to yell. Jesus was fasting. That's very helpful. And he was praying, and he was in solitude and stillness. silence and solitude and stillness. And he would just change the channel and redirect his thought from the lie to the corresponding truth of scripture. So every scripture that Jesus quotes is making the opposite point to the devil's lie.
Yeah.
So Evagrius literally made a handbook with 500 entries, where we get the concept of the 7 deadly sins, is all from his book, where he would just list out in these kind of major categories: anger, lust, greed, fear, the thought, the logosmai, that was this demonic idea, and then a scripture to combat it. And every time that thought would come up, he would change the channel and he would meditate on that scripture, whether it was once a day or 100 times a day. This was what he thought of as prayerful discipleship to Jesus.
Man, that's good.
That's pretty interesting.
Yeah. All right, let's land here.
And by the way, in the back of the book is a monastic handbook for combating demons, where I have a little worksheet for you to do this. And I couldn't, if you read the book, please take the time to do this. I've been doing it for the last year or two on my own, kind of just prayer journaling life, and it has been transformed. I've been doing it all day today, actually. It's book release day. I'm all like, it's hard to be emotionally relaxed about a book, and like, will it flop? Will it whatever? Will it disappoint people? Will people hate it? Will I get canceled? Whatever. And so I read Psalm 27 this morning. One thing have I desired of the Lord, and that will I do after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord forever, to seek his face and behold his beauty. And I thought that's all I need to be a happy person, is to be in the presence of God. And so I just, every time those fears would come,
you're doing the work this morning.
I would just kind of not think about it, calm, and I would just think that scripture and then move on.
Yeah. So someone asked, and I've heard you mention this before, that this book took the most out of you, of the ones that you've written, and might be the most important that you've written yet. And so I just would love for you to end by giving us a little insight into your person, and just saying, what was it about this book that took the most out of you? And how do you feel today on release day for this book?
Yeah. Well, whatever's wrong with it, it's too late now.
Yeah.
As you know that feeling. There's that saying in writing, you're never done writing, you're just out of time.
Yeah.
And that's very true. Yeah, it was definitely the hardest book I've ever had to write, which I guess is not surprising if you think about the subject material. Both intellectually, it was a lot of work, and then spiritually. Spiritual warfare is not language used by Jesus or the New Testament. But whatever the right language for that is, it's hard to quantify, because sometimes is this thought just a thought? Is this feeling just a feeling? Is this just because I didn't eat enough today, or I didn't sleep enough last night, or I said yes to too many things and I'm tired? Or is this Satan, or whatever? And it's hard. Or is this just a flat tire, or somebody that doesn't like me, or bad luck? Or is this, the world, the flesh, and the devil? And it's hard to know sometimes. It's not like clear a lot of, to your point on discernment and growing in our capacity. I think the longer you follow Jesus, the more that you mature and develop. It's like, I think discernment is almost like a muscle that we all have, that we have to build over years of discipleship. And I think as you grow that discernment muscle, it gets easier and easier. But still, no matter how discerning you are, there's moments you're like, I don't know. And so I don't know how much, this was definitely the most difficult thing I've ever had to write. I generally love writing. I enjoy my time writing. I did not with this one. It just felt like war to get this thing out. And I don't know how much of that was the world, the flesh, and the devil, and how much of it was just editing a book through 2020. And, I don't know. As far as if it's the most important, I don't know. Readers will judge, who've read some of my other stuff will have to be the judge of that. I'm too close to it, I feel like it's some stuff that really needs to be said, and I need to hear, and people that I love and care about need to hear. And it was worth me putting my neck on the line, in a sense, because this was not like a great path to the bestseller list or whatever, but I really felt, just at a pastoral level, man, we gotta get some of this stuff said, and I just it's the Ignatius of Loyola line. How can I be helpful? And that, I think the older you get, no, I'm sorry, not Ignatius, that was Teresa of Avila. She said, when one reaches the highest point of spiritual maturity, which I'm not even anywhere close to, she said, you have only one question left. How can I be helpful? And I'm nowhere close to the highest point, but, maybe a quarter of the way up the mountain at most. I think I'm increasingly asking that question. How can I be helpful?
Yeah, I know.
Hoping the book is.
Yeah, and I know you're not looking for this, but I just want to say thank you for writing it. Thank you for taking the time to do the hard intellectual work. Thank you for writing a book that feels like it requires courage. Thank you for writing a book that has enough of your soul in it that you're reading Psalm 27 and battling in prayer on release day. That is a substantive work that matters to put into the world. So on behalf of one of many people who will read it, on behalf of a leader of a faith community going after the same things that you're going after, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for choosing to write this book, and thank you for the work that you've put into it. And it is my hope that it meets that deep need to be helpful that you've offered it up for. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Thanks for this. Thanks to everyone who joined
Yeah,
to
thanks for
celebrate
coming.
today.
Yeah.
And well done, man.
All right, everyone. Oh, the chat is blowing up. Everyone wants to say thank you for this incredible experience. I am dropping the links to John Mark's books, including this new one with the beautiful cover, and Tyler's book in the chat. I'm gonna wait for a second because everyone's typing how much they love YouTube. So I want to make sure people can actually see the links beforehand. But thank you too so much for this wonderful event. I'm so happy that you chose us for your release date, for your little book birthday.
It's a tradition. I love it. Nowhere else I'd rather be than Powell's books on a release day.
We'd love to hear it. So let me drop these links real quick, and then you two can.
How many people were with us tonight? I can't see.
220.
Oh, beautiful.
That would have been a full room at Powell's.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Probably would have been almost
from New Zealand or Australia.
True.
You know?
They would have flown in. It's fine. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this wonderful night, and thank you for sticking around. It went a little over, but not as much over as we thought it would go, which is, best of both worlds. I'm going to drop the link to our YouTube channel. I'm assuming that many of you will want to rewatch this in the upcoming weeks. It should be posted, I would say, by Monday at the latest. And you too, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Peace.
Yeah, peace to you all.
And then buy this book. Have a good night, everyone.